Lecture 5. November 23rd, 1965. Theory and Practice, November 23rd, 65. No dichotomy of theory and practice. Feuerbach theses, not to be interpreted in this way. The meaning is not that philosophy lags behind the aspect of its realization. On the one hand, that is according to the state of the forces of production. It would in fact be more possible than ever, thwarted by relations of production. But it should not be thought of as if it were all about to happen, at least in its general trend. Especially as in Marx, that possibility goes against the trend. Anyone who fails to recognize this commits himself to the bad. It is wrong to infer from practice any restriction on thinking. Brecht and idealism. But the fact that philosophical idealism was criticized only dogmatically by Lenin is a case of false, that is, heteronymous practice. Interpret means elucidate, not necessarily recognize. My thesis: interpretation is criticism. Without interpretation in this sense, there can be no true practice. Marx probably really did mean to say that philosophers should abandon their activities in favor of politics. Ambivalence in Marx. On the one hand, he calls for complete scientific objectivity. On the other hand, philosophy is denounced. There is a problem in this, but it has to be thought through. No relapse into mere contemplation. We cannot think any true thought unless we want the true. Thinking is itself an aspect of practice. The intention remains change, but against pseudo-activity, against the over-hasty question of practice that shackles the forces of production. Probably only the non-restricted thought is capable of being practical. November 23rd, 65. Ladies and gentlemen, I have received a letter from one of you that I found extremely moving. It was connected with what I said last time about the theses on Feuerbach, and also took issue with some of the statements contained in my essay, Why Still Philosophy, from the collection Interventions. Before responding to this letter, and I wish to do that, I would like to begin by carrying on with the observations that I was really only able to touch on last time, so that they came out much more crudely than I had intended, as is always the problem in such cases. What I wanted to say quite simply was that if the nucleus of time and the transition to practice are as crucial as they are in the Marxist conception, then we cannot retain our detachment at the level of theory from the fact that the transition to practice did not occur in the way in which it had been predicted. We cannot bring the moment of transition to a standstill. I was tempted to use the term of the moment, favored by Kierkegaard or Tillich. We cannot conserve the moment or bring it to a standstill. And today we simply cannot think anymore as Marx thought, namely that the revolution was imminent, simply because, on the one hand, the proletariat in his day was not integrated in bourgeois society, and on the other hand, bourgeois society did not yet possess the vast instruments of power, both actual physical instruments of power and also psychological instruments in the broadest sense, that it now has. Both factors, together with the increasing process of integration, have come together to make the concept of a revolution highly problematic nowadays. Ideas of practice cannot afford to ignore the fact that, on the one hand, the revolution has turned into an administratively introduced despotism, and, on the other hand, this is opposed by the mere technical innovation of the atomic bomb. Jürgen von Kempsky has written an extremely interesting article about this, and I would recommend that you look it up in Merkur. The fact is that the possibility of a violent overthrow of existing society by the proletariat has come to seem touchingly innocent, and this means that the entire problem of reformism, even the famous question of reformism, which, as you know, was violently attacked in classical Marxism, has now assumed a completely different aspect from the one it had previously. And I wanted in the first instance merely to make you aware of this entire problem complex. A revolutionary practice that has been endlessly postponed and has to be deferred further to the Greek calends, or else to be utterly transformed, can no longer act as the court of appeal that authorizes us to dismiss philosophy as hopelessly out of date. My view would be that, to reflect on why it did not happen and why it could not happen, this theoretical question is a matter of no small significance for a philosophy that claims to be relevant today. It belongs, if I may express it in this way, to a dialectical anthropology, which is assuredly no small part of the problem of philosophy in our time. On the other hand, philosophy's own claim to identity as proclaimed by Hegel faltered at the crucial step, namely the transition to practice in which, according to Marxist doctrine, the realm of freedom is supposed to coincide with the realm of necessity. Hence, philosophy itself is in need of radical self-criticism and must give some thought to why all that failed to come to pass. Last time I spoke to you of the idea of the deprovincialization of philosophy, and in doing so, I had all this very much in mind. I was very aware that philosophy, particularly in the way that German idealism interpreted itself as a philosophy of history, entirely ignored these truly decisive world historical factors. Perhaps I may strike a personal note here, in the jargon of authenticity, about which I shall have more to say. Presently, I attacked a number of representatives of philosophy, such as my Tübingen colleague, Bollnow, by quoting from their writings. My intention was not to arouse any feelings of hostility towards them. I do not know Mr. Bollnow personally. I have never met him. I wanted only, and you would do well to read such books from this philosophical standpoint, I wanted only to offer you some graphic illustrations of the provincialization of which philosophy needs to be cured. I wish to call for an antidote to the view that all is right with the world so as to enable philosophy to transcend the realm of edifying Sunday cant. For it is undoubtedly true that philosophy has become a secularized theology in the less than positive sense that it lapses into a preaching tone, something that unfortunately can already be seen in Hegel on occasion, and that a progressive theology would no longer trust itself to adopt nowadays. I would like now to come back to the letter I received from one of you. I believe that it expresses in a very admirable and, if I may say so, very succinct way something that I am certain has occurred to you in response to the issues that I touched on towards the end of my last lecture and the beginning of this one. I am very well aware that many of you have felt very strongly about what I have said, and that your genuine interest in philosophy has been aroused. For that very reason, I would like to discuss this particular question in greater depth. I should like to start by saying that there is no simple dichotomy between theory and practice, and that presumably Marx himself did not believe in a simple dichotomy either. This letter pointed this out, and I believe that, if you reflect a little, you will not find what I have to say objectionable. It is quite certain that it would be a mistake to interpret the Feuerbach theses as the expression of a purely practicistic view. What speaks against such a view is Marx's criticism of the theory of absolute action, independent of theory, that he leveled at the various anarchist currents of his time, whose pure activism he equated with this lack of theory. When Marx talks about science, a number of different things are run together. One aspect of it quite certainly is the model of the natural sciences, which he was far more impressed by as a model for the social sciences than is possible for us nowadays, or at any rate for those of us in the non-conforming trends of sociology. On the other hand, what this concept of science probably meant to him was that society could be understood theoretically, and that it had to be explained theoretically by reference to its own concept, that is the concept of exchange, in order for us to be able to act correctly. That was his belief, and when he says, "Hitherto the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways," what that hitherto implies is not the renunciation of theory and the view that all we need to do is to wade in with our fists and there will be no more need for thought. This idea is in fact fascist, and it would be grossly unjust to Marx to impute such views to him. Nor did I mean to suggest that philosophy can regress to a state prior to its realization, and that we can comfortably make ourselves at home with Aristotle's notion of the dianoetic virtues, in which philosophy is sufficient unto itself. For philosophy, I believe that sometimes it is important to state the obvious. Differs from art, in that it is no autonomous structure complete in itself, but that it constantly refers to a reality outside itself, outside its own ideas. It is in fact this relationship between thought and that which is not thought that constitutes the core theme of philosophy. If philosophy is concerned with the real, then it is evident that a purely contemplative relation to this reality A relation that does not envisage any practical action is nonsensical because an act of thought about reality is whether consciously or not always a practical act. However, when we say that philosophy must not regress to a point anterior to its realization, we have to point to something far more drastic from the side of the object, namely to something that the feeling of imprisonment, of incarceration which we all have, makes us all too prone to forget. And this is why I am so very grateful to the writer of this letter, since he has made me realize that something had to be said that I suppose had seemed so obvious to me that I omitted to say it, and the result was that I gave a misleading impression. The fact is that this too is a very drastic situation, namely the fact that from one perspective, that of the forces of production, it would be possible to organize the world in such a way that there would no longer be any want, and hence deprivation and pressure, and that this would be immediately possible now. In this sense, the saying of Franz Femfert, now or in 100 years, is as topical now as it ever was. And if we fail to follow up this idea that the forces of production could satisfy human needs and enable mankind to enter into a condition worthy of human beings, if we fail to give voice to this thought, then we certainly will be in danger of giving ideology a helping hand. Such an outcome is prevented only by the relations of production and by the extension of the forces of production into the machinery of physical and intellectual power. I believe then that we have to begin by saying this, and that a possible starting point for a correct practice is to rethink how to put a society on the right path, when on the one hand, it threatens to stagnate owing to the ossified relations of production and the attitudes resulting from that situation, while, on the other hand, it ceaselessly produces the forces that initially promote destruction, but that tomorrow or the day after, if I may put it crassly, could actually make possible a paradise on earth. But I believe that we have to make a distinction here. The gentleman who wrote the letter said we must make distinctions, and I am more than happy to oblige. So in my view, it would be a mistake to believe that, even with the inconceivable acceleration in the relations of production that we have witnessed, the transformation into the realm of freedom might be on the verge of taking place in line with the historical trend. The situation is rather that society has discovered ways and means of channeling the unstoppable growth in the forces of production and of keeping it under control. In consequence, what Marx regarded as the self-evident equivalence between the advances of the forces of production and the emancipation of mankind has ceased to hold good. Moreover, it is not enough for us to live in hope that the history of mankind will move towards a satisfactory state of affairs of its own accord, and that all that will be required from us is a bit of a push from time to time to ensure that everything works out, even though, and here too I would rather err on the side of caution, we should bear in mind, and in this respect Marx was undoubtedly right to maintain that the forces of production, in other words, human energies, and their extension in technology, have a tendency of their own to overcome the limits that have been set by society. To regard this overcoming as a kind of natural law, however, and to imagine that it has to happen in this way, and that it has to happen immediately, that would render the entire situation harmless, since it would undermine every kind of practice that placed its reliance on it. And finally, in taking the link between theory and practice seriously, one of our most vital tasks is to realize that thought is not a priori impotent in the face of a possible practice. This was in fact the point of Marx's criticism of an abstract utopia. To fail to recognize this is to fail to recognize that the possibility we have to hold on to today is not simply one that goes along with the trend, with the historical tendency, but one that runs counter to it. I would say that anyone in this position will probably find himself subscribing to the bad tendency, that is, the negative, destructive trend. I would maintain further, and I believe that this is the point that will be of immediate importance for you, and I would ask your indulgence if my remarks are excessively ad hominem, that there is a very great risk that the idea of practice will lead to a shackling of theory. By this I mean that ideas of all sorts are restricted by the insistence on the question, yes, but what must I do in practice? what can I do with this idea? Or even, if you think in this way, you will stand in the way of some possible practice or other. It is always happening that when you address the enormous barriers facing every conceivable political intervention stemming from the relations of production and the social institutions built around them, that when you address this, you instantly receive the reply, yes, but, an objection that I regard as one of the greatest dangers in intellectual life. Indeed, how can we hope ever to get anywhere if we think in this way? We shall never be able to achieve anything, since we shall be forced to sit around twiddling our thumbs. And I would say the feature that seems to me to be characteristic of the application, the consistent application, of the Feuerbach thesis I referred to earlier, is actually the idea that theory itself should be captured from the end point of the terminus ad quem. Perhaps I may be allowed to tell you about an incident that took place a long time ago. It must be 24 years between Brecht and myself in Los Angeles. I had just worked out the main thrust of my book Against Epistemology, a book that did not appear until many years later. My idea was not to criticize idealism dogmatically by contrasting it with a materialist philosophy, but to explode idealism from within by judging it according to its own yardstick. I explained this to Brecht on one occasion. It did not occur to Brecht to take this idea at all seriously. Instead, he remarked that there already existed a book that was, so to speak, he often expressed himself in such terms, a classical book. He meant Lenin's book on imperiocriticism. In it all, that work had already been done. This was a book that had authority, and if anyone were to undertake this philosophical chore once again, it would simply be a wasted effort. And I could not avoid the impression that he tended a little bit to think that, if Lenin had accomplished this in such a book, it was something of an impertinence on the part of someone who was unable to boast of a comparable political success, to do all that was claimed and recited in what I can only call unending and desperately monotonous repetitions. Now, I would say that the standpoint adopted by Brecht, who after all has to be taken very seriously in such matters, seems to me not only theoretically insufficient, it seems to me not only to replace the strenuous effort of the notion with dogma, but I would say, and I say this with particular emphasis to those among you who are inclined to give absolute precedence to practicism, that such a view contributes to a bad practice. For to take a dogmatic view of that book of Lenin's, or indeed all books by Lenin, or even all the books ever produced by Marxism, is the precise equivalent of the procedures adopted by administrations that have set themselves up in the name of Marxism, that have absolved themselves of the need for any further thought, and that have done nothing but base their own acts of violence on these theories without thinking them through and developing them critically. I believe that this is a particularly drastic example. Those of you who have escaped from the East, and this will be true of quite a number of you, will remember how over there materialism was dogmatically institutionalized as a kind of worldview to which people had to commit themselves. But by that very fact, the authorities fell below the standards of their own theoretical ambitions, their scientific ambitions, in particular the claim that their consciousness was to be the most progressive consciousness, and that we should make this insight our own. Such claims are trampled on. That is the decisive factor, and I would maintain that it simply cuts the ground from beneath the feet of a certain kind of practicism, to say nothing of its naivety and helplessness in the current situation. The letter I have received goes on to ask about the meaning of the word interpret, and in this connection, a sentence of Marx's was referred to in which interpreting was said to amount to the same thing as recognition. Marx presumably used the notion of recognition alongside that of interpreting. If my correspondent, if I may refer to him in this way, asks me, and he puts his question in a very friendly way, he asks me very trustingly whether recognition is necessarily contained in the concept of interpretation, I would reply, no, it is not necessarily implied, but what is essential is what I have been attempting to explain to you in the course of these lectures. And this is crucial, namely, that interpretation is much the same as criticism, that there can really be no interpretation that is not critical interpretation, as opposed to affirmative interpretation. That is what might be described as the general thesis I should like to present you with here. But without such an interpretation, that is, without a fully thought-out idea in control of itself, I believe that there can be no such thing as true practice. That aside, I believe that Marx really did believe, and we have to think back to the period in which the writings we are considering here were written, that is to say, around the year 1848, that philosophers would in fact be best advised to pack it in and become revolutionaries. In other words, man the barricades which, as is well known, cannot be found anywhere nowadays, and if they were to be erected in any advanced society today, they would be quickly eliminated by police or security guards. But he probably did mean something of the sort. And the idea was this: I believe this shouldn't be softened up too much, that the end of classical German philosophy, as it was called at the time, would be succeeded by the heritage of socialism, in which this philosophy would realize itself. And in so doing, in this respect, Marx and Engels were good Hegelians, would negate, would abolish itself, so that there would in fact no longer be any place left for philosophy. I believe that if we do inquire into Marx's view of this problem, we find that his position was highly ambivalent, and this ambivalence points to the presence of a problem that needs to be thought through anew and in a principled way. It is always the case that whenever thinkers as powerful as Marx or Hegel or Kant arrive at an impasse, it is not a good idea to be too clever in resolving the resulting antinomies. In general, it is far better to assure oneself of the necessity of such antinomies. On the one hand, as a student of classical economics, Marx called for full scientific objectivity. If you look at the passage that Horkheimer and I quoted in the preface to Dr. Schmidt's book on Marx, you will see how resolutely he expressed himself on the subject of a science that has a thema probandum. On the other hand, he was unsparing in his denunciations of a self-contained philosophy. The possible answer that suggests itself is, of course, that the realm for which he demanded autonomy in this sense was science, and that to a certain degree he naively played science off against philosophy, which he dismissed as old hat, while at the same time he endorsed a science based on a Darwinist model as the appropriate standard for his day. In the meantime, we have come to realize something that he and Engels also understood very clearly, that science is not only a force of production, but that it is implicated in the social power relations and command structures of its age. It follows from this that we cannot simply transfer to science the authority purloined from philosophy, or the authority denied to philosophy by criticism. Meanwhile, the conceptless science, it too, has been subject to a dialectic of history. It is no longer the same as it had appeared to Marx and Engels. A conceptless science in the meantime has undergone a development, as a result of which it is quite certainly unable to carry out the critical function that the founders of a so-called scientific socialism had entrusted it with. If anything, it has been moving in the opposite direction. In consequence, so-called scientific problems inevitably turn into problems of how science is to reflect on itself, of how science is to be criticized, the way in which science understands itself. In other words, these problems refer science back to the philosophy from which they were originally stolen. And it is this very process of referring science back to philosophy by virtue of its own reflection on itself that appears to me to be so closely bound up with the call for the actuality of philosophy, its contemporary relevance, that I have raised here. Finally, however, I should like to say that there is no intention here of advocating a relapse into contemplation, as was to be found in the great idealist philosophies, and ultimately even in Hegel. Despite the great importance of practice in the Hegelian system, no such a relapse can be contemplated here. The late Karl Korsch, who, as you perhaps know, had been Brecht's philosophy teacher, criticized Horkheimer and myself even more sharply, already in America, and also later on, after the publication of Dialectic of Enlightenment. His objection was that we had regressed to the standpoint of left Hegelianism. This does not seem right to me because the standpoint of pure contemplation can no longer be sustained, though we should note incidentally that the polarity Marx constructs between pure contemplation on the one hand and his own political philosophy on the other does only partial justice to the intentions of left Hegelianism. This is a difficult question, one that will be resolved only by the detailed analyses of the left Hegelian thinkers that are only now starting to get underway, although we cannot deny the impressive political instincts which alerted Marx to the presence of the retrograde, and above all, nationalist potential in such thinkers as Bruno Bauer, Stirner, and Ruger. Now I believe that what has transpired since, in both theory and actuality, means that we need have no fear of such a regression from a dialectical theory which happens not to be naive. At least, that is my hope. I mean that it is not possible to think a right thought unless one wills the right thing to happen. That is to say, unless underlying this thought and providing it with a truly animating power, there is the desire that it should be right for human beings to enter into a condition in which meaningless suffering should come to an end, and in which I can only express it negatively, the spell hanging over mankind should be lifted. For thinking itself is always a form of behavior. It is, whether it likes it or not, a kind of practice, even in its purest logical operations. Every synthesis it creates brings about change. Every judgment that links two ideas together that were separate previously is, as such, work. I would be tempted to say it always brings about a minute change in the world. And once thinking sets out in its purest form to bring about change in even the smallest thing, no power on earth can separate theory from practice in an absolute way. The separation of theory and practice is itself an expression of reified consciousness, and it is the task of philosophy to dismantle the rigidity, the dogmatic and irreconcilable character of this separation. But what I mean here by refusing to operate with the concept of practice as many people do, and as I am sure many of you do find tempting, is that I would not like to confuse practice with pseudo-activity. I would like to prevent you from becoming involved in this, not so as to set myself up as an authority, but simply to impress you a little bit with the arguments I have put forward today in the hope that you will think these matters through yourselves, that you will not imagine that you are achieving anything essential if you become an organizer, to use the term thought up in America to describe people who bring people together, organize them, agitate, and do other things of this sort. In every activity there has to be a relation to the relevance, the potential it contains. Nowadays especially, precisely because decisive activity is blocked and because, as I have already explained often enough, thinking itself has become paralyzed and impotent, chance practice has become a substitute for the things that do not happen. And the more people sense that this is not actually true practice, the more doggedly and passionately their minds become fixated on it. This explains why I wish to proclaim my reservations about those who are too quick to call for action, about the passport inspectors who no longer ask every practice for its theoretical justification, which is certainly just as misguided, but conversely demand that every thought produces its visa. Okay, but what can you do with it? My view is that such behavior impedes action instead of promoting it. And I would add that the possibility of a valid practice presupposes the full and undiminished awareness of the blockage of practice. If we measure a thought immediately by its possible realization, the productive force of thinking will be shackled as a result. The only thought that can be made practical is the thought that is not restricted in advance by the practice to which it is directly applied. So dialectical, in my view, is the relation between theory and practice. And I hope that I have succeeded, as far as was at all possible in my reduced condition today, in going some way to satisfying the request for a fuller explanation of what I said last time. Lecture 6. November 20.